Aresta Tsosie-Paddock, could ego the Lagana with Echeshije. Shmaeya, Dorothy Tsosie-Paddock, Williende, Shije, Andy Paddock, Williende, Nle, the Navajoland, Nle, Tawani Lake, Dori Wichigo, a audit IEC, Nasha, Kosheya, Na Kaidum Ashley, Bobby Betwani, Bashachin, Ado, Kizatlane, Dashache, Ado Kia Ani, a Dashanala. A could be the teacher, but the Sigi area, the second generation, the Navajo relocatees were experiencing and coping with the loss and cultural dispossession and displacement. A could be the Kaya Basahalon, Basahalona, a Ardage, the Hasnaniki, a Konde A Bachinigi, they Kintako. Dasnanigi a article shenanish ado elahit ego job bikeya sacho tish ebanada do the Hawani Mazda beta dendo elahit ego do beina and they will fit Nisano, Ebina, Ede, article Shananish Isha, Coco, okay. So, my study is on second generation Navajo relocatees, and these are the children of the original relocatees, and this would be the first generation. And they would have resided in these areas and as well as in some of these areas. And because this here is the HPL and these white areas are NPL. And this is in reference to the Navajo and Hopi Land Settlement Act of 1974. Third generation go you'd kill. Ado fourth generation eight fishing away as a chimney that's a tank. Coho echad the hawan echad the bikaya. She put on at the kid. I don't do the land-centered connectivity paradigm. So this is a framework that I use. I was originally using another model called Peoplehood Matrix, which was developed by several scholars, including Tom Holmes, who was a professor at the University of Arizona. And so I tried to use this model, but it really wasn't quite working for me. So I began to modify it, and so what I did was I argue, of course, that land-centered connectivity land is central. Without land, then we're unable to do our livelihood. The beta, get the lieta, clean the beka shida, ina, aro, so Origin Javago, the Navigation, the Arjun, the Hoshao, the Nekachi, Yatida, you don't use your language a lot. The Coco, Aro, the ceremonies, Ada, the article, or your attention. They the Navigation, Najata, Ado, Hawaii Mother, the Hawaii Mother, Hanover, Edo, they express they borrow it or they don't have access to it. Although the sacred history with Yaki, John the Hawako, Hadishi, Nita, although Kujitate, with the small plant that's a Hono, although Kujitate, Joe, the Hazanida, Kaya. So I argue that land is central. Without it, we lack livelihood, traditional livelihood. We don't speak as much of our language. Ceremony is lacking in sacred history, so it's, but if you're on the land, you're more likely to have this, okay? Akoko, here's a brief background. I think many of us pretty much know a little bit about the historical events that have taken place, and in this regard, I start out with the Navajo Long Walk. And the Navajo Long Walk is pretty much a failed, resettlement, a failed form of relocation. So in 1964 to 1968, although 1968 we had the treaty that was signed, and many of the Navajo people were able to come home back to within the 4 sacred mountains. And we also have the Executive Order of 1882. So this is, this is where the land dispute is focused on. And so you had, individual, federal agents, we call them federal or Indian agents, and in this regard we have one individual who wanted to have jurisdictional, be able to set in some policies to be able to have a say-so in what happens in this 1882 executive order. So what they did was President Arthur created the 1882 reservation. And so we go through the livestock reduction of the 1930s as well. And so in 43, this becomes a District 6, which becomes exclusively Hopi. Although you had Navajos, we probably, we live in an area where we have grazing district, like 3, 4, and 5, and so this one so happens to be number 6. And that became exclusively Hopi land. And so we know that between Navajos and Hopis, they're pretty firm about their existence within this territory and within the 4 mountains. And our relationship with between both tribes have been, they were allies, they intermarried, they were neighbors, they traded, and they had ceremonies together, and they had resources, so those were shared. So going forward to 1958, of course you have the question of who owns the 1882 reservation. So in order to answer those questions, Congress allowed the Navajos and Hopis to sue one another by introducing the Act of 1958. And without it, they couldn't sue each other. And so you have at least, three cases, but I only have, let's see here, the Healings and Jones. So the question, who owns 1882 reservation? So the ruling was that both tribes have equal rights to surface and subsurface, and that the joint use area, this area up here, the 1882, is for both tribes, but this is, exclusively Hopi. And so it went up to the Supreme Court, but basically the Supreme Court did not hear it, but they upheld the 1862 hearing. Okay? And so we jump to the 1966 Bennett freeze. And you have Mr. Bennett who imposed that, and basically it was meant a way for the Navajos to settle with the Hopis. And if they did not settle with the Hopis in their appropriate time period, then they put a moratorium on all forms of development. Even probably relatives who couldn't fix their windows or repair their roofs, or they had several families living in one home. So this lasted and until Barack Obama signed off on it, and benefits was it was unfrozen. So now we are looking into developing the benefit area. So if you can tell, kind of okay, so the 1868 treaty, 1882 joint use area, District 6, and then the whole benefits area. Okay. So what I am, so we have individuals or families who resided in this area, and so you have the passage of the Navajo Hopi Land Land Settlement Act of 1974. So if you were one of those families that had to relocate off, HPL Hopi partition lands, then you had to see if you were eligible for benefits. And so Dida Dida Tijana Hosheya Hawana Zahadota. And so you had to prove, several, go through some of the criteria, and you had to be head of household, or an immediate family have to be residents of December 22nd of 1974. So this is a very important date. And this is also a reflection of the law that was passed. And then you have to demonstrate residency. You have to prove that that's your place, okay? And if you are, say you're a family of 5, and you have your parents, 3 children, and if the children, became 18 later on after the parents received benefits, then if they applied for relocation, they would be part of this household, and they could not get relocation benefits. And benefits is kind of those terms that makes it sound good, but it's really a loss. It's a loss for Navajo families, and so. And then you have to qualify as head of household of July 7th of 1986. So really quickly, so I think I like to, there was a map that I wanted to show you how it was partitioned, but I think I left, here we go. Let me go back. Okay. So going back to the benefits. So if you were from here, then, you could apply for benefits, but you have to prove residency and eligibility. And if you were Hopi that live in a white area, then, same thing as well. So, okay? And so that's what the partition area looks like. Okay. So other alternatives, aside from getting relocation benefits and perhaps moving off the reservation, but there was also life estates where you were able to stay where you're at, and I think you had to be over 40 years old, if I recall. You have the 1996 accommodation agreement as well, where you entered into this 75-year lease, with the other tribe, and so, or you can relocate to a con-reservation area, to one of the communities, perhaps to the city, perhaps to coal mining, perhaps to, maybe Pinyon or Loop, somewhere, even, as far away as Wonder Rock. So, but getting a home site lease was sort of this bureaucratic process. And so often, you were limited to one acre or less than an acre. So really, the amount of land and resources and the homes that the Navajo families lost did not compare to what they were receiving. And the other one, urban areas, usually 1 acre or less, and then you have new lands. And so you have to be, sponsored, and ask for permission to live there as well. So right now, we have this, the relocation status. We have those who are certified here, and these were, they were eligible. They're eligible for benefits. And then those are denied, and this is how many people applied. And this also includes the District 6 relocatees. 9 were certified, 121 were denied, and we have 211 that applied. And then this is the Hopis. The number of Hopis that were certified to relocate, 11 were denied, but the total Hopi applicants was 39. So if you look at the population between, it's very uneven. And then here, this is data. Let's see here. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, this is data I received from the relocation office in Flagstaff. So number of families 3570 relocated from HPL. So you have 2,373 that moved onto the reservation to home sites, and you have 1,200 that moved off the reservation. And here is another reflection of those numbers with the Hopis. And so my study looked at the three areas, Flagstaff, Phoenix, and Winslow, because those were the top host communities. And so you have you have over 2,000 that moved to Flagstaff. And when we say members of household, this is like the applicants, and then how many were in the families as well. And then you have Phoenix was the next highest one, and then you have Winslow, which had 131 household that relocated to that area. But they've also relocated to other areas, other urban areas as well. But those were the top 3. Okay. So the purpose of my study was to examine the impacts of Navajo Hopi Land Settlement Act of 1974, particularly on second generation, because I had a question: where are they? Who are these children of relocation? That's one of my positionality is I am a child of relocation. My parents relocated back in 1977. They did not speak English, and so at that time we didn't have the option of moving to new lands, and they really didn't know where to put us except to, off a reservation. And so, my mother got ill shortly after that, and so it was a real struggle for them. And as someone who has grown up in that environment, I wanted to know how that you say, how Khalid al ina they I found that one of my own cousins was relocating, and we were really close, but we never talked about it. There's that stigma attached to it. So I targeted children who are living in the urban areas, and because I heard from her they don't have land based on the reservation, so yes, I thought that would be so anyways, and I wanted to know what their perspectives were. What was their experience because of the policy. So okay.
I'm gonna take the box.
Okay. Okay. All right. So this is where the children would have lived, and they would have, moved off the reservation. Oh, this is a double slide. Okay. Okay. So my rationale: why did I do this, and why, why did I target the children, the second generation? Okay, so we have one study who was that was done by Thayer Scudders in 1980. He studied adult relocatees and potential relocatees, and this would be in the category of my parents. But he also mentioned, there was a large number of young children. And then we have Dr. Jenny Joe, who's the net. She did 2 studies on relocation. So she was in the community of Hard Rock. She was there for at least 3 years. And then we have Orit Tamir. She did her study in the Pinyon area in 1987 and 1990, between those time periods, focused on the relationship between relocatees and the host communities. And also she did a follow-up study to investigate what happened to the original Navajo relocatees. Okay, so my research question was, how has the relocation experience impacted the lives of second-generation Navajo relocatees who are now adults living in towns or cities of the Navajo Nation? What is their perspectives and challenges after relocation? And also the question of what's their experience with federal and Navajo government? What have the federal and Navajo government roles been in the lives of these relocatees? So, going back to my theoretical framework, where I argue that land is central to, in this case, Navajo relocatees, and without it, there's a loss in their livelihood. Ceremonies, language, and then I talk about the sacred history of the umbilical cord and so forth. Okay. So I went through literature review, and one, Roman Mitsui was the executive director for a very long time, and so he did his work before Congress, and they basically originally estimated that 1,000 Navajos would be relocated, but now it's more than that. If you include the original, the first generation, if you include second generation, third generation, now we're coming upon the fourth generation of relocatees. And so then we have over 12,000, but it's much more than 12,000. And then, studies, we have the lots of 3 important elements from relocatees: land, home, and livestock. And also the impacts of compulsory or forced relocation. You have this multiple dimensional stress, the hatishi, the okutego, niga, hointi, koho, ado, that little is known about the effects of relocation on children in comparison to the elderly, and the children might be the forgotten victims. And then the other studies, Jenny Jo, with her study in Hard Rock, that's a very traditional area, and the children also, share the same concerns as their parents, and they felt neglected, and they felt excluded from this, the relocation plan. And so, essentially, there was no relocation plan beyond the first generation. Okay, and so Tamir, Dr. Tamir, she basically indicated losing, entire customary lands that provided subsistence, increased stress, depression. Okay, there's this sense of loss, this loss of place, independence, and your initiative, self-respect, and so forth. And so basically, so this loss of first generation left the children relocatees in an indeterminate state due to forced relocation of their parents, leaving them no land use rights of their own. And so this is and so I think it's important to remember that when you have, relocation law, such as this one, the Navajo and Hopi Relocation Settlement Act, that is a mandate. That's a forced relocation. and it's not voluntary. At some point, those people that live, the Navajos that live in the partition area, would have to move. So I talked a little bit about myself and what my positionality is. So basically, I have personal experience. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. I have experience the process. I have insight to the language and the culture. I have a network of contacts. I guess an insider in this whole study. Then with the trust of the community as well. So with this, I was able to get a supporting resolution from my chapter, from Loop chapter, and also a resolution from the Western Agency Consortium, or Navajo Western Agency Council, yes, and so forth. So, okay. So my data collection, we have this term called triangulation, where you get 3 sources and they all have to connect. So I did a form of a survey that we call Q method. And basically, this is a form of survey where the person that's doing the survey has knowledge or have experience of what the survey is about, okay? And they have their perspectives and their views through subjective means, okay? So I had 40 survey question statements, and they were ranked on a grid. I didn't provide the grid, but yeah, it's just a grid, and then you have 40 statements that you put each statement and how you feel in the order of 1 to 4, or -1 to -4. Okay, and then in-depth interviews where people where second generation have knowledge and can talk about their experiences. And then, of course, field notes, official documents, and so forth, primary documents. So. And so my participants were, they were relocated as children, as minor, and I had about 72 respondents to the survey, and they were not randomly selected, okay? So, and they were located through word of mouth, through networking and community meetings. And the participants composed of Navajo individuals who have varying degrees of knowledge about relocation policy and its impact on relocatees, either directly or indirectly. So the participants have to be, their parents had to have relocated. So that was one stipulation. They come from a family that's relocated, and they were children. And they were, and also that they applied for relocation benefits and were denied. So that was another stipulation I put in there. And they had to be former residents of HPL. Okay. So 72 participants, locations from Flag, Phoenix, Winslow, and I often, met them in coffee shops, public libraries, in their homes, at restaurants. So anywhere in parks, anywhere I could get the survey completed, and I interviewed 10 participants, same criteria as well, and they were from Flag, Winslow, and often met them in their homes where they were more comfortable, and also in public libraries. So with the Q method, the surveys, I have five members who were on this particular committee, advisory committee, and they were Navajo citizens, and they had in-depth knowledge about relocation, and so they, that was so you kind of yes, and it was an off-reservation study in the urban areas, okay? So what they did was they evaluated my survey, the statements and the process, and they said that works, okay? So now I go to my findings of my surveys, the Q method, okay? So with the findings of the survey, there were 3 themes that came out, okay? One was livelihood. And the other one was urbanism, and the other one was traditionalism. So I kind of gave them names based on, what type of themes came up. So you had more individuals in their livelihood, 37 out of 72, at 51%. Urbanism was next, 12 out of 72, 17%. Traditionalism was 11%. And other variables of 21%, they could be maybe there was one theme that came, one tiny theme, or it was something that you could not really take apart. But the three were definitely definite, and those were the emergent themes. Okay. So, going back here, you have livelihood, urbanism, traditionalism. Okay. So on a scale of 1 to 4, 4 being the highest. Okay. So question number 6 was securing land for a home to pass on to my children. That was very important. That got the most rating, I guess. And then next, they understood that living in a town city provided access to education and employment. And then they were concerned about the lands Navajo Nation were purchased on behalf of relocatees and why they were not able to or allowed to settle on these. And then passing down traditional knowledge, teaching language lessons that was disrupted because of relocation, and they felt that it was important to teach their children and grandchildren the Navajo language. Okay, and so now we go to urbanism. So they indicated that living in a town city provides access and education, and they consider the town and city as their new community. Okay, and they talked about housing. It's easy to find housing in the city, and they are aware that living in an area, everything's English, and that changes everything in who they are as the next people. And so living in the urban areas marginalize their speaking of the Navajo language. If they fell in the traditionalism factor, then it was important that traditional knowledge, teaching lessons on morality, that was important to them. Kinao was important to them. Having access to medicine people and to have ceremony, where it was difficult for them to do that in an urban setting. And they indicated it's challenging to be, when you're not in a Navajo community, that it's challenging to be able to practice some of these traditional aspects of being on Navajo. And one thing is having access to a hogan was important for them, because some of them talked about borrowing a hogan, or some of them, they couldn't do the ceremony because they didn't have a hogan, and so that they felt that was really important. So going to the actual interviews. So in the land area, the livelihood area, okay, so Tess, she says, they had all that land and it was taken, and now they can't rebuild. So that was her, oops, hold on. Okay. And then you have a place for descendants. You had Christina, she was one interviewee. If I had a place to say right here is your home, I think it would make me feel better. So the parent would feel better if her child had a home to go back to anytime they wanted to. But not only for her son, but also for her grandchildren. And it was indicated that it secures a space for descendants. And then, having a place on Navajo, or within the 4 mountains, you can try to teach a culture so much off the reservation, but it becomes like, it felt like you were telling stories, and she felt like you needed to be there. You needed to keep our ways of life. And Shannon, she was very certain that it was important to pass land on to children. It only makes them aware of their identity. And their connection, and to family and culture, and so she had this interest of wanting her children to have a place. Okay. And so in this sense, I think we're talking about second and third, or third and fourth generation. So language, Yuma indicated that it was rare and that for them to speak Navajo, he's fluent, but he says that when we begin to speak Navajo, it always breaks up, and then we go back to speaking English. So Shannon, she said, I never pass my language to my kids. It's a big impact. Maybe you don't speak Navajo every day, but you just say words here and there, okay? So some of the challenges that they experience is that land is hard to get. The process to get a home site lease is that you have to have people that live around you sign your papers, and other people that have more land, if you go to them, they won't sign your papers for you because they will say that this is my land, you lost yours, and yours is over there, and we can't sign it for you, okay? And to Norse, also the idea of, that criteria to be eligible for so-called benefits is narrow, okay? So Norris, he says, we gave up our homeland for free, and there's no compensation for us who are the descendants of the people who lived there and made a living there. Now we're just living wherever. Okay? So now we have those who are focused on the urban areas. They see the education, the benefits, opportunities, and access to school, employment. And Joan, she says there's not a whole lot of jobs on the reservation. Housing, you can own a home or rent a home. And Shannon, she happened to buy her own home and take it upon a mortgage. And so she says nobody's going to tell her to move away. And also for the children, I had one, Franklin. He mentioned the YMCA, the summer camps, the youth programs, and the church, and just a whole lot more events that happen in the urban areas. So the challenges they find is that it's expensive and different, and the language, they rarely speak it. They're marginalized in speaking the language. And ceremonies, they're rare participants in the ceremonies. Whereas before, some of them were regular participants. Okay, for those who fell into traditionalism aspect of it, Yuma basically says, you have traditional knowledge, the plants, the springs, the paths, the livestock, and you can weave and so forth. But he was interesting. He says, where to go and not to go. Where to get your onions, where the berries are, where fresh waters are, plants, and which bushes to avoid because some of them, had snakes. And so he had this, this traditional knowledge about, his home back before his family was relocated. And Shannon, she says that before relocation, her mother and her grandmother's residence were just a few yards apart. And in the same area, they had all of their relatives, they had their chays and siblings and cousins and all in that area. And so, it just indicates that that's no longer there. Now she has cousins, and she goes, and so, when they were living like that, they will always help one another, right? And so they always had this, getting food, farming together, and so forth. And so Samantha's, we were all brothers and sisters, and we knew each other. Everybody knew the families stayed together, and it was always family first. And so she basically says their tradition and culture was all intact, okay? But after relocation, Nora says, I see families scattered all over the place. I see the destruction of relocation now. And Yuma, I think one important thing they lost is the teaching of the elders, the moral teaching as opposed to the Western way of thinking. That's hard for them now at this point because they all seem, confused. They're not provided the the knowledge and maybe how planship works is missing, or maybe how, as a female, how, you need to act, and all, as well as a male. Some of those lessons were missing. And so also you have ceremonial events. So this is where, the hogan on a piece of land we call home is difficult now. We have to borrow people's hogans. We have to move around with our ceremonies in order to practice our religion in Navajo way, in order to practice our faith that comes with land because of Mother Earth. All these connections to the land, and it's not there. And, another interviewee, her name is Paulina, and she basically says that what really affects my family is we don't have a place to put a hogan. So yes, all those, and these are, the perspectives and experiences of relocatees as children, the changes they see in their lifetime. And they are now parents, and in some cases, grandparents as well. Okay. So the question, how has the relocation experience impacted the lives of second-generation Navajo children, now adults living in cities and towns or cities off Navajo Nation? What have been the perspectives and challenges of the participants after relocation? So basically, I think they experience land loss. They understand that land is essential. It secures land for the future. Many of them have no place to return to. Home sites it's a bureaucratic process, and some of them indicated that, that's kind of a deterrent for them. And some of them have tried, and they were, one interviewee, she was told no. But they do value their education and their employment, and they understand that Navajo language is important to communicate with the elders, oral tradition, and world views. Urbanism, they value urban opportunities, education, employment, housing. They're acclimated, very young relocatees, primary, yes, so I don't remember what that one is. Some of them are not really interested in returning to Navajo to live here, but they do come up and visit, relatives, friends. They're aware that their language is marginalized and that Navajo language classes are important to them. Okay? Traditionalism, they understand that relocation is a disruptor. It disrupts traditional knowledge. It disrupts, because of the lack of land. Ceremonial access to hogan is, can most likely not available, and access to a medicine man is not always there. And not enough exposure to the language, to speak the language, to have that conversation, and to be able to maintain it sometimes. Important for traditional practices, the Navajo language, you say. Okay. So their experience with the federal and Navajo government has been that, one, as minors are displaced from their customary lands, the Office of Navajo Hopi Indian Relocation, they felt like they tell stories about being discouraged to apply. And when they do apply, they're denied home replacement benefits, and they believe that it's a real unfair process, and that, beyond their parents, they're not within that sphere of being able to be participants and to rebuild their lives. And so Navajo Nation, bureaucratic in terms of home site lease, and their priority is economic development for some of those lands that were purchased besides new lands. And so basically the conclusion, I think, this doesn't include Hopi second generation relocatees. I didn't get an opportunity to interview them. So the feeling is that the relocation plans really needed to focus on several generations ahead and not just, the first one, the parents. And also contributes to my discipline. it adds to global resettlement studies as well, and and one is how does relocation, another question is how does relocation impacts traditional Navajo matriarchy? If you have a Navajo woman who has relocated, how does she fit into the world of matriarchy? Because everything is passed through the woman, and what if the woman has no land, So these are questions that that come up as well. So okay, not the kidate, or I'll let the moderator.
Hi, sorry, I got held up at registration this morning, so we have time for some questions, maybe 3, if you have any.
May I just make a comment? So, you wrote about, you said correctly, not correctly, you said that relocatees express loss of traditionalism in town. I found that relocatees on the reservation that were moved from one location to another, to a new location, not their own chapter, somebody else's chapter, expressed very similar sentiments and felt as outsiders, even though they lived on the reservation. And the rest of it, they could continue and use the language. They could go back sometimes to conduct ceremonies in their old location, so long that it was outside HPL and inside NPL. But some of the same expressions were also, some sentiments were expressed by relocatees that moved to reservation locations. And one more comment, I suspect that a lot of the sentiments, if you look cross-culturally around the world, will also apply to other tribal societies, because in tribal societies, beliefs and practices, and I do not use the term religion, the beliefs and practices and the whole identity are directly, like you said, linked to location. In the Dine case, between the Four Sacred Mountains, other tribal societies, they have their locations. The Hopis and Moki have their own locations. So it will be really interesting to compare this to the sense of loss of land, loss of identity, loss of language of other tribal people around the world that also were forced to move from their land to non-traditional land. Because some of the Navajo live within the Four Sacred Mountains, they can retain at least some, not all, sense of identity. They lose a sense of place.
Mm-hmm.
But once they're out in Phoenix, it's...
Yeah, I know of one study, because of the dams they were building in China.
Yeah,
we had one scholar who looked at second generation as well. And so that was one of the...
So many people see the root cause of the relocation was the mining and NGS. Was there any reference to that? And also now that NGS is going to be closing by the end of next year, what do you see as closure?
Well, okay, I did not include the natural resource portion of this in here. I have way more slides, and I have to kind of pick and choose what to include. Yes, some of these questions, the question of, energy companies asking who does this land belong to. You have the 1882 reservation, and also you have the legacy of John Boyden, working in conflict of interest for the energy company and the Hopis. So I think those are documented, and now you have the closure of the mine. I think the sentiment with global warming and the lack of interest in mining, using fossil fuel as a way to energize some of the major cities that it has been using, such as Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Phoenix, and now we have solar. And so not sure what, within that area, the Black Mesa area, and how that would infiltrate across the relocation area. If that's how that would impact the residents there, or even the tribe.
Well, I guess my question is, was there knowledge of that? I'm wondering if that's also being lost. Or was it brought up by them? I know you didn't ask them specifically.
Okay.
That wasn't one of your questions, but as you were speaking with them, did any of them just self
Yeah.
bring that up?
Yes, they would mention, I think a couple of them did mention the energy and how that impacted their families with, having to relocate. And I think, for example, it seems like back in the early 70s, that was not common knowledge amongst Navajo families that, there was this divisiveness that was going to be created. And because of what was underneath, valuable coal, because my parents, they never talked about that. And they would say, Hati beniya nihinat anido, and, they wanted guidance, or they wanted something from the leaders. And that was something that they lacked. And so I think as we learn more and more about it, just like in my case, the energy company had quite a bit to do with it. That was kind of the root.
Okay. I know we had a few more comments. If we could hold those comments till the end. Aresta, will you be available at lunch to field any questions? So if you want to have a chance to talk with her a little bit more later,
Kelsey, John, Yanashie, Bilagana Edashmat, Lasche Ebashichin, Bilagana Edashiche, Bit Anne Edashinale, Isnas Pastinasha, Auto, PhD Ulta Nishle, NTU, Auto, Syracuse University, Danashnish. Good morning, everyone. So happy to be here today. So on the program, it's saying that I'm presenting just one chapter of my doctoral dissertation, but actually after speaking with the Navajo Research Board this past week, I thought it would be best to present the whole thing. So I would love to talk in depth. It'll be more of a broad overview of the whole research project, but I would love to talk in depth about more parts of it. So anyway, I think this is a good space for feedback and also data dissemination within the community. So my doctoral dissertation is called What Can Fleet Teach Us About Decolonizing Education? So I started this project with a couple of major priorities in mind. And the first is looking at Bene land, people, and animals, and keeping that central to the project, and especially with animals. Also, of course, centering Bene language, culture, and worldview. And then also, probably most importantly, is having the research be service-oriented and something that creates positive relationships in the community and is giving back knowledge and creating pathways that are going to be helpful through the dissertation research. So I like to give some definitions when locating my scholarship, and one of the first ones, as it is a part of my theoretical framework, is settler colonialism. So settler colonialism is kind of a new emerging field among Native scholars from all different tribes. And so basically what they're saying is that there's different types of colonialisms. And in particular, there is settler colonialism and settler nations, like the US and like Canada. And the difference between this is that instead of colonization being something in which colonizers might go to a space and pull out, or not, with settler colonialism, the settlers stay in that space. And so then the structure of colonialism is not just an event in history, but it's an ongoing structure. And the way that Indigenous scholars have defined this work is that it's a continual erasure of Indigenous peoples' lands, and again, not an event, but an ongoing structure. And it also highlights the particulars of Indigenous nations within settler nations and the negotiations that they have to make with those federal and state governments. So in my title, I have the word decolonial, and so I always like to define this as well. So the way that I've defined this in my project is actively and critically engaging oppressive structures that decenter Indigenous ways of knowing, both local and structural. So I think in my work it's really important not only to do theoretical work, but also to do very particular community, grassroots, and material work as well. So one of my favorite kind of quotes with decolonial is that it's not a metaphor. It's not simply, historical event, but it's also an ongoing material structure that's very real in the lives of Indigenous peoples. And then finally, I like to call my methods methodology rather than methods. So in traditional research, people sort of use a theory and then they use a method, and then they conduct their research. All these things are very separate. But as other Indigenous researchers have seen, this has been kind of violent to communities. It doesn't take a holistic perspective. It doesn't consider the positionality of the researcher, and it also tends to decenter land and decenter animals. So with methodology, I like to say it's a holistic approach to meaning making that's carefully crafted to center Indigenous communities and worldviews. So a lot of the worldviews, well, basically all the worldviews up until now that have informed Western research have been from a Western perspective. And so in my work, I'm trying to sort of decenter that Western perspective and start with a Dine perspective. So in doing this, I kind of came across and just remembered and couldn't get out of my mind horses. So I grew up actually in Oklahoma, so I didn't grow up on Navajo Nation, but I grew up with horses, and I grew up with Navajo Mustangs that were either like taken in after horse roundups by my grandfather, or just sort of showed up, right? You acquire these Mustangs over time. And so anyway, this is my horse here. His name's Rusty. He's a red-brown Mustang. So as I started to think about what's a Dine worldview, and what's a Dine worldview as I know it too, I started to think about these horses, and then I also started to think about my father, who's Dine, and his horsemanship and training with horses, working with horses. And so as I conceptualized this project more, I wanted to center a lot of these things all at the same time. I wanted to talk about land and the erasure of Indigenous peoples through the lens of settler colonial studies. I also wanted to incorporate Dine language, also Dine philosophy of education, and then finally, in doing decolonial work, it's always centering healing as well. So I know from my personal experience that horses are healers, and I think that most Navajo people know that as well, too. So it's a different approach to keep a Dine sort of icon, I don't know if I like that word, at the center of the research, but then also to keep healing at the center of the research as well, too. So in my research, I have a few goals that I keep in mind, and the first is to center a Dine philosophy of education. So this is something that's already, there's a lot of work done on this already. So I knew that, coming back to my community, that there was already going to be some spaces to connect, especially in educational spaces, which is where I'm coming from. I also wanted to position community and tradition knowledge as expert knowledge. So really reversing this idea of simply an informant, but saying this knowledge is the epistemic foundation of the research. This knowledge is scientific. And my third data chapter goes into that a lot. Then I also wanted to connect livestock and horses specifically to the Dine philosophy of education. I knew that they were connected already. I knew that they were present in like the 4 cardinal directions as it informs the Dine philosophy of education, but I wanted to kind of get into that a little bit more and connect livestock and horse education outside of the formal schooling space with some work being done on Dine philosophy within educational formal schooling spaces. So I was doing this by building and collecting knowledge that was that is directly addressing community challenges, and then centering it in the tribal university space. So kind of connecting the institutional schooling, decolonizing educational space at tribal universities with community knowledge on horses, a first form of education for Dine people. So again, my research site was a tribal college university. It was a space that had not only an established Dine studies, but also a vet tech school as well. And also a land-grant university, so a space that's meant to do research that is directly serving the community and the community's needs. I did 12 months of field work, and I did interviews and group interviews with Navajo men and women who are 18 years or older that had any kind of affiliation with horses. So it could be, actual horse trainer, could be someone who just grew up with horses and had a lot of stories. It's very broad, right? There are many ways to be involved with horses. So again, I had a couple of methods of data collection here. One was participant observation. So in my research, I'm always very particular about situating myself in my own positionality. So in my work, I kind of situated myself in this educational space, not only because it's a place where I can connect in sort of a real way, a comfortable way, but also it's a space that is already offering these courses. So I participated in a few Dine Studies courses just to familiarize myself with language and then also with work being done on Dine philosophy of education as well. And this was also good to develop relationships within the university too. So I was alongside, students and instructors, and people really got to know me and know my educational background, like my theoretical background, why I'm doing what I'm doing. The people that I interviewed some of them were affiliated with the university, faculty, staff, and students, but a lot of them were community members as well. So maybe people affiliated and working with the DNR, chapter officials, horse trainers, farriers, all different kinds of people. Then I also did talking circles, and this was just a space to bring a more collective perspective within the research. And then finally, I did photo elicitation. So I left space for visual data within interviews, just because when you're talking about horses, you always want to show a picture or you want to get the visual aspect of that. And because I couldn't be formally there with people and horses at the same time, I allowed that space for a lot of visual parts too of the dissertation. So these were some of the questions that I asked in interviews. How have horses been a part of your life? Usually that question can open up tons and tons of stories and information. I also asked, of course, in doing research on horses, you can't avoid the large amount of free-range horses on Navajo Nation. So even though this isn't the central concern of my dissertation, I'm also not shying away from it either. And I know that whatever's developing through this work also has very real consequences for this community and controversial issue too. So I asked people about it and didn't really, try to keep it as outside of the dissertation. However, I found that one of the best ways to think about not only free-range horses, but also very controversial ideas of grazing and land within the nation was to talk about fences. And so I started asking people just, what about fences? What do you think they represent on Navajo Nation? And this brought me tons and tons of clarity, not only on changes in livestock policy, but also it was sort of a depoliticized, neutral way to talk about some of the land issues that are very real in the community. And then, of course, always centering the healing aspect of horses as well. So lots of stories about healing. So my data analysis was pretty standard, except that in my data analysis, what I did was I liked to take each interview kind of as a whole. So traditionally with qualitative and grounded theory, you have your data set that you transcribe, your interview, and you code pieces of it by looking at it. So I started by doing that, but I realized that it wasn't working because the codes weren't making sense to the entire story that someone was telling me in that interview, in that set interview. So what I started doing instead was I started listening to interviews over and over again to sort of take them in holistically. And then I used transcribing and translation as my coding process. So as I'm transcribing this interview, it's almost re-entering my head in a verbal way that's kind of helping me internalize it differently. So from there, I started creating code memos, which were based on the themes that I was getting from these kind of larger stories. And in a code memo, I would give a description of the theme. So one of my themes was fences. Then I would give some keywords, illustrations, so I might take stories or big quotes from interviews and insert them in there. But then I was also taking my own writing too. So throughout this process, I'm participating in courses, I'm in the community, right? I have family members here, I do things outside of my research, but it's all still connected through me. So I'm writing about that and I'm thinking about that. And then I'm also pinning quotes from literature on Indigenous studies, decolonizing methodologies, and other Native scholars' work on land issues, livestock issues. And so from there, I began drafting my data chapters. So it's a little bit different type of data analysis to keep it more holistic. One of the most important parts of my research is member checking. So I was in pretty good relationship with most of the participants for my research, and I wanted them to be really aware of what the findings were, aware of how I was understanding their stories. So I did a lot of follow-up interviews, but then I also did talking circles. So everyone who participated in a talking circle or a group interview had already done an individual one. So what I did was I transcribed the individual interview, came up with codes, checked those codes with the individuals, if it was okay for me to bring them to the talking circle, and they all said that it was. So then I kind of put those up for debate within a group setting with participants. So it brought a lot of clarity, but then it also brought depth to somebody may have brought up one theme, and then, a former or a fellow, horse trainer would be like, oh yeah, and build from that theme as well. So it was a really good space. Like I said, I did follow-up interviews. And then once I drafted all of my data chapters, I came up with an outline for all 4 data chapters, and I met with each person who I had interviewed individually and showed them exactly where their quote appeared in my dissertation and under which outline, like which chapter and which section of that chapter as well. So everyone is not only aware of exactly what words are going in the dissertation, but also how they're being used and where they're situated. So that was a lot of work, but I think it was really worth it because I have the kind of clarity that I feel like I'm representing participants' words in a way that makes sense to them, but also that they could give me feedback, right, or clarifications on that final data chapter. So the first data chapter is really focused on fences. And like I said, fences have been a great way to sort of depoliticize the conversation, make it a little less interpersonal, and more focused on the ways in which land practices have been forced and are continually forced on the community through the act of fencing. So in my dissertation and my findings, I looked at 3 major levels of fencing. And fencing isn't always physical fencing, but it can also be confinement as well, too. And that was something that I found. So the first level of fencing is looking at the larger creation of the Navajo Reservation. So with this, as traditional Navajos, we know that we belong within the 4 sacred mountains. However, the creation of a reservation space is kind of the first area of confinement and the first way in which our relationship to the land through fencing is assaulted and in a lot of ways erased as well. So I found, and my participants talked a lot about this, about how this form of fencing creates a lot of animosity within the community based on reservation and off reservation. We've all heard this dichotomy before. And I even use it, right? Like I said, I didn't grow up on the reservation. And so, so this was the first form of fencing. The second was grazing permits. So my participants really explained to me in depth how the creation of these grazing units within Navajo Nation completely destroyed the worldview and the relationship to livestock as well. So people explained to me that, for generations, families had agreed upon grazing units, right? There was a system of pastoralism based on and based on where clans originate, where families originate from. So after the livestock reductions, the Bureau of Indian Affairs creates these grazing areas which are running through family agreement areas. And also, they switch livestock ownership from a female to a male name as well. So this really destroys a lot of understandings and organization, not only socially, but economically as well. And then the last form of fencing, which I thought was really interesting to kind of change things up a little bit, is corrals. So my participants spoke to me about the way to traditionally build a corral and to situate it, where to situate it, south of your hogan. You need to put the gate in a certain space. So there's this spatial awareness, this spatial mapping of how to in one conversation, we talked about it as kind of creating a mini Dine universe in your home space with the hogan, with the corral, with your area, with your horses as well. So I like this because I think that even though fencing has represented colonization, confinement, and non-traditional grazing, it's also something that is traditional, right? And people use their corrals to keep their horses safe, to keep their livestock safe, bring them in at night, turn them out during the day, this sort of traditional, cyclical pastoralism. So, the second data chapter is addressing Tsosie-Paddock. And I think this was probably the most complex chapter for me, not only because this is an incredibly complex phrase and idea within Dine philosophy, but also because it made me confront gender as a female Dine researcher in my community. And so I have a degree in women's and gender studies, and I wasn't necessarily situating the dissertation as a gender study, but I think in moving forward, I couldn't not use a gendered lens, an indigenous feminist lens, to do this work. So, looks like my things are a little messed up here, but we'll start with one. So, first of all, as I was learning more about Dine philosophy of education, one of the ways in which I began to understand Tsosie-Paddock is that it's the foundation to Dine philosophy, and that includes gender. And so in Dine philosophy, gender is not an anthropocentric thing. It's not human-centered, but everything is gendered in the Dine universe, from plants to the hogan to the fire to livestock, everything. And so I think that that's the first and most important thing to foreground in looking at gender and Tsosie-Paddock. And then I also began to understand that it's important to take a gendered view of livestock and horses because horses are a part of our system, as is everything within the Dine universe. And so if I'm not understanding gender from Dine perspective, then I'm also not going to understand horses and their positionality within Dine philosophy. However, at the same time, I know that decolonizing education and settler colonialism has a gendered aspect. And so I couldn't ignore social and gendered issues of heteropatriarchy on Navajo Nation currently as well. So in this chapter, it's sort of doing dual things. On the one hand, I'm trying to center this non-anthropocentric concept of gender, right, and especially of equality of male and female as a pairing rather than a hierarchy. But at the same time, I'm facing very real violences of settler colonialism that have messed with gender on Navajo Nation, and to which this ideal of gender does not exist in all spaces. So it's kind of both things. You're decolonizing, you're trying to deal with the violence within the community, but you're also trying to center the original concept of gender as well. So within this too, I found that it was a good way to think through the horse as a part of but then also through my participants' feedback to think of the horse also as Tsosie-Paddock. So knowing that the horse has both male and female, but then to take it further in that the horse has both beauty and protection. There's aspects of relating with horses, training horses, and this was explained to me in a lot of depth, especially by trainers, who are saying that when you're relating to a horse, you know, you are loving toward them, right? You're respectful of them. You know that they're sacred. You're reverent of them, but you're also protective, right? You have to have a level of sternness with them. You can't be completely raising them in which you're hugging them all the time and, you know, like a dog, because then they're going to run you over when they're full grown. And so any horse trainer knows that, right? Like you want your horse to have both of those balances. And so that's why I loved using the example of horses for Tsosie-Paddock because it's all connected. From horse training to I know how to relate to this creature that can hurt me, both in a loving and protective way, but I'm also balancing, I'm dealing with violent issues of sexual violence within Navajo Nation due to settler colonialism, while also trying to say, oh, we have this traditional view of gender that's very non-hierarchical and non-violent as well. Chapter 3 is, I'm going through this very quickly. Chapter 3 is the chapter in which I give some, but not a lot, of the metaphorical and material connections that the horse has to the Dine universe. So when I first started doing this research, my grandpa and my dad, when they're like, okay, you're doing research on horses, they kept being like horse hooves, horse hooves, horse hooves. And I heard this my whole life, right? Growing up, my dad shows me the bottom of the horse hoof. It's an arrowhead, that means protection. And so I think this is something that, we all hear as Thanet children if we grew up around horses. And so I took this as it was, and I knew it, but it wasn't until I really began to invest in learning language and kind of decolonizing my worldview of what's science and what's knowledge and philosophy that it really started to click for me. And so in this work, people gave me a lot of these types of connections, right, in my interviews. They said, this represents this on the horse. But one of the most important parts of this as a data chapter, and especially as something that's being read by a lot of non-Thanet people, is that these connections are not simply metaphorical. They're not simply something that's like kind of romanticized. And they're actually very scientifically and epistemologically complex connections. And so for me, I didn't understand that even as a Thanet person until I became very much invested in language learning and also like learning horse songs as well too. So I spend a lot of time in this chapter really advocating for Thanet knowledge is not just myths or stories and this kind of thing. A lot of, like I said, I participate in a lot of non-Thanet spaces academically, and so I am constantly trying to position Thanet knowledge as scientific to gain that respect, and also to sort of advocate for Thanet people doing our own research on our own things on our own land. So that's sort of the first part of this chapter. Then I move into looking at how horses are sacred because they're emanating from creation, right? These connections are showing that horses are not only with us from the beginning of time, but also that they connect us back to everything. Again, connect us back to the Thanet universe. And so these elemental parts are representing both something very sacred, but also very scientific too. So some of the things is that, hooves are protection, dahonie, that the eyes are stars, and I love this too because, if you know horses, they can see at night too. And so in understanding that the eyes are stars sounds really simplistic in English, but it's actually a very scientific connection, right? In understanding night vision. The ears are corn. The mane and tail are also representations of male and female rain. So one of my favorite sort of characterizations of the horse as scientific is riding horses and the connection that you have to all of these elements and to the beginning of time. So as you're connecting to the horse through riding, and as you're connecting to Thanet universe, you're also connecting to like these generations of knowledge and people. So finally, I like to end on a high note, of course, with my dissertation, and so I end with healing, looking at concepts and stories of healing. So again, decolonization is about engaging these sort of critical structures, like taking a critical perspective at not only settler colonialism and what's been done to Thanet people, but also what's happening within the community that needs to change as well, those violences, but then centering the opposite of that, which is healing. And so as I learned more about horses, and I knew this from the beginning, right, but I just heard more stories that confirmed it through my interviews, is that, horses are healers. And so any work that anyone would do on decolonization really requires an engagement with horses. And so, number 2 is incomplete sentence there, but I heard a lot of stories of healing. And some of these were as simple as, when I have a really hard day, I come home and I ride my horse, and then, he rolls and I just watch my problems roll off his back. Kind of a traditional concept of riding. But then I also heard more intense stories of healing, of people who had gone through intense and traumatic violences, and their relationship to their horse was what helped them get through that, kind of build back their confidence, or to regain an understanding of themselves, to learn how to trust again. So building familiarity and trust in riding horses was a major part of this process as well. And it's not always like super romanticized and glamorous either. Like many of the practices that help you build that familiarity and trust is just the everyday. Like I feed my horse every morning, I get up, Like, I comb him, I clean stalls, right? It's not always like glamorous, like, yay, horses, but there's a lot of time and effort that's put into that. So finally, what I close with in the dissertation that I think is not only helpful to the NEF community, but also to the scholarly communities in which we participate in, is that many of the work being done in decolonization and in Native studies tends to have an air of negativity to it, kind of a doomsday of like settler colonialism is erasing everything. But I like the way that horses point back to a continuation of the NEF people. And so this was articulated to me in many different ways, but one of which is that horses have been with us from the beginning of time. And so because of that, they'll continue to be with us in different forms, whatever that might be. But also that we'll continue to be in relationship with them, no matter what happens, because that's how it was created to be. So I love this because my participants are centering the NEF creation as the beginning and the end, as the restructuring and the rehealing process. And so it's not that they're saying like, oh, everything's going to be okay, we don't have to do anything, but it's kind of they're using horses to plug into this, Hajona Hasli. We're always returning to this completion again. We're returning to balance. We're returning to healing, no matter what happens within the community. And so I love centering this by centering horses because it brings something different and it grounds decolonial research in something different that's not just negative or Western, stuff is erasing us. And it brings in horsemanship as a process of that can connect to people who are already doing work on language and culture, but that work might not always include younger generations who don't have that knowledge, but horses in some ways are a connecting point back to those things. And a lot of people who have horse knowledge are not necessarily academics or not necessarily people who would participate in these spaces, and so I love that connection as well as a form of healing. So some of my participant feedback whenever I met with them to go over the data chapters was, I had one participant who really stressed to me that instead of saying simply Tene, that I needed to say Nahokadian Tene, because the nature of my research is decolonial and it's connecting Tene people back to the land. And so he's saying, when you say this, you're saying you're a holy earth surface person, and this phrase is coming from the creation stories in which show, right, that we emerge from the earth. And so he's saying part of being decolonial is using this phrase and understanding ourselves to be not only holy, but also earth surface people. It's very meaningful for our connection to livestock and to land. I mentioned this already, but in one of my member checking meetings, the person sort of reiterated that when doing decolonial work, you're always doing like a zooming in, whether that's to a specific issue or kind of zooming into the NEF community and then zooming out again. And so he said that the good thing about the NEF philosophy is that everything within the NEF philosophy is kind of like a mini representation of the NEF universe. So it's already embedded in our understanding of being to be local and then to be global at the same time. And this is important not only for organizing your hogan, right? Organizing your family in a traditional way, but also doing decolonial work, understanding that there's on the ground very real material issues of settler colonialism, but at the same time, being able to zoom out and see those in a larger global context in the ways, having an understanding of both systems and then also of the local as well. I also talked a lot too about, in my work I was exchanging and hearing a lot of sacred knowledge. And so I had some really intentional conversations with people about what the protection of that knowledge means. And so one individual kind of told me, in certain instances, people aren't going to tell you this information, right, in an interview dissertation setting, and that's okay, because it's their protection. But also, she's iterating too, this is your knowledge as well. When people give you this, it's like a gift, and so you have to be careful in what way you share that, or what context, or even how much you share as well. So I liked having these intentional conversations around the protection of knowledge, and that's the reason why there's not really a ton of that knowledge that's sacred to us about horses in my dissertation, because it's mostly for non-Dene audience. It is for Dene, but people who are actually sitting down reading the whole thing are usually mostly non-Dene people. And so it's more of making a point, like, decolonize. And then finally, again, just a reiteration that the horse is the anarchic ehejon. So it is our vehicle, right, both literally and metaphorically, to a continued renewal and a kind of hope for the future. So these are all of the spaces in which, I gave data dissemination. So I've given this same presentation in all of these different spaces and gotten feedback. So from the local chapter, of course, who I was working with from the beginning when I started this research, also the Eastern Agency Council. I plan to present at the DNR Summit, probably a little more focused on the fences aspect, the fences chapter, and looking at grazing and community conversations around grazing. Also presented to the research board here at the Nest Studies Conference, a local university, NTU, and then the Net Education Conference. So looking at just getting feedback in many different forms and kind of letting the community know. So this is really the major, sort of close of this particular project. So this is a conference that is being hosted at NTU, which is where I work. I work as an instructor there in the Nest Studies. And it's called Flimping Do Flimpahanet, Horses Connecting Communities Across Navajo Nation. In my research, I learned a lot of things, but I also, one of the major things is that I saw that there was kind of an enthusiasm to have more community events centered around horses. And so I like doing this in the NTU space because NTU is a land-grant university. And so its whole mission and purpose is to do these types of events. I also wanted to sort of create this culture and conversation about the sacredness of horses in a way that's going to be non-controversial. So a lot of horse conferences and horse events tend to just focus on feral horse issues on Navajo Nation, and this conference is not like ignoring that fact, but it's also not putting it at the center. And so the way in which I have organized this to be is to center the sacredness, the stories, and the songs, but also to learn about good practices of horsemanship and even alternatives for dealing with feral horse issues as well. So this is a schedule of the day. I have a community member who's going to share horse songs and connect it to modern day horsemanship. And then I also have an individual who runs the Four Corners Equine Rescue, which is in Aztec, New Mexico. That's somewhere else where I also work, working with horses. And she's great because she is going to sort of present what is an equine rescue anyway, and how do you organize it? What can you do? And I love this because it's presenting a non-controversial alternative and solution to feral horse issues. Obviously, it isn't going to deal with the whole thing, but no one is against horse adoption, unless you're like just awful. But I think in general, Navajo people are not against, right? If you're getting them off the land to where they're not overgrazing, but you're also maintaining the integrity and the sacredness of horses, equine rescues are kind of at the center of that. So this is simply just someone who's an expert in the equine rescue world coming and sharing that knowledge and giving some place to maybe even community members who kind of feel hopeless around this issue. There's a lot of hopelessness with, you see all these horses, they're not in good shape, and you don't really know what to do. Well, I started volunteering at equine rescue where I train Mustangs off Navajo Nation to deal with that. So sort of looking at, what are the real things that you can do as a community member to address these. The vet club at NTU is going to be selling during lunch. And then also I have a horse training demonstration from an individual named Matt Smiley, and he has started his own business doing horsemanship. And so he's great too because he's gone all around to different schools and stuff doing demonstrations of colt starting, but he's also a young guy who's starting a business and doing something, on the nation, and I think is an inspiration to younger people to go back to these traditional forms of horse training, but also, you can make a living doing this too, right? There's areas to sort of plug into traditional ways of being that can also get you a job. So I have a lot of future plans for this research. As I said, I'm the NES, so I'm always going to be involved in the community. I'm an instructor at NTU. I would love to continue and create courses that are focused specifically on the NEF livestock knowledge, so not just horses, but also, sheep as well, ranching in different forms. And I think that this is good because I like this work to stay internal to the university. So a university or a course at a Navajo tribal college or university where it's all Dine students. Is that my 5-minute mark? Okay. And then also I would love to see horsemanship come back into the university setting. So as I said, horses were original form of education for us, and for me too. Like, I knew how to ride a horse before I ever knew how to write anything. And so connecting those things, because there's so much that you can learn from training and working with horses. Also in my work as an academic, I contribute to like these methodological conversations of theory and methods and ways in which we can continue as Dine scholars, we're all doing this as Dine scholars, to write these articles and build these frameworks that are going to be helpful for future Dine students who are doing education and doing research, right? When I started this dissertation, there was some Dine literature out there, but not a lot. So I really hope that, my kids and my grandkids are going to have so much wealth of academic knowledge to pull from when they're coming back to their community or staying in their community to do research. So again, doing that. Also, continually engaging like the political side of control over research and livestock policy. So in my work, I did a lot of historical reading on the Dine livestock reductions and found that, big surprise, non-Navajo researchers are doing the research that informs livestock reduction policy. And so to me, I'm like, we don't want that to happen again. And so as an academic, Dine academic, I'm continuously advocating for, our own control of our own research and policy, and also doing that through the tribal university space, using that as a resource, right? Let's get major research programs going at places like NTU so that we don't have to keep advocating for doing our own research and policy. Also, kind of looking, again, centering the healing nature of horses. So really super long term. I mentioned a lot of my engagement with gender issues and gender violences on Navajo Nation. So I also work as a sexual assault advocate. So in the future, I would love to kind of harness equine healing with traditional Dine horse healing for sexual assault survivors as well. So knowing that, a huge percentage of Dine people are sexual assault survivors, and there's also a crap ton of horses out there. And so to me, the connection is like, why are we not making that connection? Some people are, but I would like to also contribute to that as well. And then also keeping traditional aspects and methods to livestock research and policy as well. So that's a challenging connection to make, but I think the tribal university space is a good place to make that because they've already been doing traditional Dine culture language within an academic space. And then finally, there's this new field of animal studies that's kind of emerging now as like this hot thing in scholarship, and I'm trying to like intercept it as it's a very white dominated field. So as a Native scholar, I'm trying to intercept it by being like, this is not a new thing. Actually, Dine people have been doing animal studies for forever, and white people actually stomped out that connection through livestock reductions and boarding schools and the genocide of our language and people. And so I'm trying to kind of foreground that field of, as this emerges and all of the research and policy and stuff that's coming out of that, there needs to be a Native perspective centered in that. And there needs to be a really critical engagement with the ways in which settler colonialism and the research institution has actually assaulted the original animal studies, which is being done by Native people. So that's kind of the conclusion of my work and presentation. I'll leave this up here because this is a conference that's free and open to the public, so you all are welcome to come. And you can find more information about it on the NTU website. You can register on there, and then you can also email me as well too, which you really can't see my email address on there. So I would write it on the board, but I don't think there's a marker. Well, my email address is kjohn@navajotech.edu if you're interested in more information about the conference. But yeah.
And I think that, you basically have touched on a real political issue that our tribal leaders have been grappling with, which is the feral horses. What do we do with it? How do we address it? Mm-hmm. And because of the traditional values on horses, the roundup has stopped. But I think I would want to add to your list and say, I'm not sure which department oversees natural resources, maybe the resource committee, to offer those things that you've offered as a recommendation in using horses for healing, for various aspects of traditional living, I think that would help them maybe bring together some plan, some knowledge, and how to address feral horses.
Yeah,
And I think the rescue is a very good idea. I don't know that there is a rescue right here on our nation.
I think there's one individual who's kind of organizing a rescue, but she's still in the beginning stages of it. And I think too, it's important to note that there are a lot of people who are doing healing projects, right? Whether it's small scale or they're kind of building it to be something bigger. And so I think a lot of the reason why that hasn't come forward more is just there's a lot of disconnect, right? It's like these people are doing it on different sides of the reservation, or they're not talking to each other. There's no real central organization of it. And so I think I always like to put that in there, right? I'm not the first person to come up with this idea, but just looking at how these things can be connected, and then maybe even supported and sponsored through government too, right? Like having a government engagement of that. So yeah.
How did you come in the interviews that you did, the topic of, what did Navajo say as far as using horse meat?
Oh, okay. I had different perspectives on it. So a lot of people would say that they remember being younger and you would butcher a colt in the fall time as a form of medicine and protection over flu, cold-like sicknesses through the winter. But that it was, you only do one and you butcher using your procedure, protocol. And then you eat that horse meat for that. However, I did have other people who are we never did that. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, because traditionally I grew up, we did open range grazing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's been, if you were raised like that, we had a big herd of sheep also and cattle. But we didn't have a lot of horses. We did, but this feral horse problem is kind of new to me, and because and I know that when my relatives or family held the Yabich, the horse was involved because it was medicine. We did butcher one, and my early memories of one of the best meats I had eaten was horse meat. I thought so that. The last Yabich that we had, that was served, so I was able to. So from time to time, I come from the western part of the reservation, so that's been a practice. And of course, you probably heard about the Grey Mountain incident with the 200 horses.
Yeah.
That was really sad, but so I think there's just a disconnect. There's the horse songs and that, and then horse. So there's some disconnection, even trading, bargaining, that kind of things that went on that we don't. I don't think we practice that anymore. So I was just. That's just kind of my thoughts, etc. That the horse is. I think there's been a lot of a disconnection that has gone on.
Yeah, I think.
So that's I know for my family, we're not taking that on, but the horses we had were very, my mother's age group from the early 1900s. That, they were really using it. I myself grew up in the wagon and horse time period. So I remember those, and I have many memories of that. And it's sad that we don't see that. And I thought, if I ever go back, which I'm planning to do, I said, I'm going to get a wagon back. That'll be my transportation.
Yeah, I wish I could drive a horse everywhere. One of the things, too, that I'll mention with the feral horse issues is that, I know it's very controversial, and part of what my first chapter on fences addresses is that so much turmoil is inter-community, right? This fighting of what are we going to do about these horses? And very few people are looking back at the settler colonial policies that have changed our relationship to the land and to the animals that are forced on us. And so I'm trying to de-center the conversation on like inter-community violence to like, let's take it back a step and look at fencing, right? Let's look at this understanding that, you know, okay, so we've got a lot of horses, right? In the outside white world, it gets characterized as like Navajo people don't know how to take care of their animals. And that's stupid. So like, because with the creation of the reservation, it all goes back to the settler colonial lens of everyone else in the U.S. is allowed to expand, except for Native people. We get confined, and so of course we have feral horses, right? Of course we have too many horses because we got trapped in on this piece of land that isn't traditional. I mean, this is traditional, but it's not all of it, right? This idea of expanding and prospering is only for non-Native people. And so I think that dealing with it from that perspective of, instead of just, oh, people don't know how to take care of their horses, is more productive in coming up with solutions about how it is that we relate to land on a policy level, right? On a more global level than like, I'm gonna yell at my neighbor or like try to shoot them because they're rounding up horses, right? So that's kind of where I see my work is like giving a clear sort of, I didn't do a great job in this slide because I was rushing, but giving this sort of demystified, here's the line of what's happened to the land through fencing and grazing policy and the changes of that, so we can understand the whole context of why things are the way they are, and it's not simply that if people don't know how to take care of horses. Oh, yeah.
I just want to say that I think both of your topics really interrelate in many ways. Number one, I'm a relocatee, so I understood everything that you're talking about. And basically, it's really interesting what our families are going through, those people that were relocated even up to today. Many have lost their homes, you know, like, so they're really landless and homeless, basically, and they're just wandering. The other part is to the horses that I'm a relocatee. I live on borrowed land, and like I also lost my home to my husband, my ex-husband, so he's got the house. But I'm now living in a place where I have sheep, I have horses, I have animals, and you know, like, and I also was one of the participants that helped with the Green Mountain horses. So, every single day we hauled horses and we saved as many as we could. And the ones that end up dying, and then you know, like the track just covered everybody. But after, you know, they covered all the horses up, and the horses still were coming from the mountain, the Green Mountain. You could see some. They knew where the water hole was, but we had to bring them out to a windmill, and we all started helping each other out, just hauling water, hauling. And then we introduced the feed to them because they weren't really sure if they should trust us. But by the time when the rains came, they all were like right there with us. And when you brought hay, they knew, so they would come from all over. And the concern was that how are we going to end up, you know, the horses, are they going to end up dependent on us? And so that was the word, and we're trying to move the horses back towards the mountain. When the rains came, they left home. So I guess they knew where home was.
Before relocation, we had like cattle. We had so have horses, but it's like each member of our family had a specific horse, and we all and so I think, I don't know, when I heard about the feral horses, I think what went through my mind is how did this come about? You know?
I have a question for you, Maria. Your study focused on the second generation of relocation because of the Hopi Relocation Act. One is, why did you decide to focus on that group as opposed to the first, third, or fourth? The other is that there were, on your timelines, there were 4 studies that were done. Did you find some similarities? And
those studies were, okay, so the first couple of studies, they seemed to focus on the first generation, and they were done in the 80s. And and 90s. And so now we're into 2018. And so I did the study back in 2015, but I never presented to academic studies, and I really wanted to share it. And so the reason why, one is because I'm a second generation, because it was my parents that relocated. And so, yeah, so that was my, coming from, like, Haja, that
You wanted to see your generation
Yeah.
more?
at Haja. And so, yeah, so that's kind of like what you've experienced.
Yeah, and it's like my children now, it's like, I guess it's doomsday for them because we relocated and my children grew up and they're working at the power plant and then boom, something else is happening. So, like we're all.
It's a scary thought, because a lot of our young, maybe even third generation are now working for SRP and they're also working for Peabody, and then they're looking at closure. And there's the 127 on the ballot to vote. And, the question is, do you vote for it? But where's the plan? If it passes, then what do we have? I haven't seen a plan, so I'm voting no. I want to excuse myself.
On that first generation, the second generation, how many of them experienced like their parents losing, if they went, we hear that they go to the cities or to the towns, how many homes, like their parents relocated, did they lose because of property taxes and that, did they also lose that home?
Once I finish presenting.
Everybody's story is different, but some of them didn't know, maybe they didn't know it was like property taxes and they weren't on home taxes. Or maybe like there were predatory natures of loan companies who had come after. Because they do have, okay, so this is one person was telling me from the real estate company. The Relocation has this book where it was everybody's name
How I share it because they're very strict about
and so they go through that list
wanting to know
and
where
they find out where the homes are and they target them.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Yeah.
it's
And it's like our names are public knowledge, just, and so that was one way. And the other way, I think it's just,
So I'm just careful, like,
just
just
a lack of money.
I'm just careful of like
Like
letting slides go, right?
it was off the res, there has to be a sense of stability attached to it, to know that you're going to be able to handle everything that comes with it. And if that doesn't happen, then they might put their homes up as a collateral and then use it. Yeah. That's what happened to my father.
But I have two relatives that moved.
Yeah.
So there's a variable.